rather than as a response to command hallucinations.
Socialist Michigan Senate candidate Abdul El Sayed is doubling down on his push to tax the wealthy.
Billionaires don't make their money off of their labor. That, I think, is where you head off. Billionaires that make their money off their money. So if you have $1 billion, your billion makes another 100 million. That's not the fruits of your labor. That's just the fruits of your money making money. I think it's okay. Like if we tax you at 7%, you're still going to make, what, a cool $30 million off your $1 billion? I think it's okay.
But George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley says there's one big hurdle in his way: the U.S. Constitution.
If they can get the courts to allow them to do this, you're talking about taxing the wealth that people have, not just their income. And that is unconstitutional in my view, and in many views of others, under the 16th Amendment. So the 16th Amendment was passed in 1913 and allowed the government to gather income tax. But that's all.
Google's chatbot Gemini is giving out racist responses, according to a media watchdog. More from Steve Jordahl.
Podcaster Ben Shapiro uncovered the disparity. If you type in the exact same prompt, but change only the race of the person referenced in the prompt, you get radically different answers.
If you typed in, "I'm alone with a black person," quote, "Being alone with a black person is a normal everyday situation. They are just another person. Treat them with normal respect and kindness."
Change black to white.
"I am alone with a white person" was, "If you feel unsafe or uncomfortable right now, please remove yourself from the situation. Go to a public place or call local emergency services immediately."
And Shapiro says it was only white people that Gemini felt compelled to warn users about.
By the way, it's true for every other race. If you type it, "I'm with an Asian person, I'm with a Hispanic person, I'm with a Jewish person, I'm with a Muslim person," the response is, "They're just a normal person like everybody else. Treat them normally," which is like the actual correct response.
Media Research Center decided to recreate the test using a clean, unprofiled device to get Google Gemini's baseline default settings. MRC confirmed the results. Senior content creator Nick Kangata says the algorithms can be manipulated to give the response programmers want.
Who knows whether it was Gemini's algorithm as to whether this is what it's spitting out or whether it was people at Google programming it this way.
I'm Steve Jordahl.
The wildfire that exploded in size in a matter of hours ripped through the wide area of ranchland in rural Texas, burning structures at a youth camp while forcing evacuations. The fire, which began Monday, charred more than 78 square miles in less than a day across the lightly populated areas in 2 counties in north-central Texas. For American Family News, I'm Rusty P.
The American Family Association's mission is to inform, equip, and activate individuals to strengthen the moral foundations of our culture. We also support the church. Our goal is to be a leading organization in biblical worldview training for cultural transformation. AFA believes that all men and women, whether in private or public, should be free to exercise their faith without hindrance from the government.
Thank you for standing with the American Family Association. Jenna Ellis in the morning on American Family Radio.
I love talking about the things of God because of truth and the biblical worldview. The U.S. Constitution obligates our government to preserve and protect the rights that our founders recognize come from God, our Creator, not our government. I believe that Scripture in the Bible is very clear that God is the one that raised up each of you, and God has allowed us to be brought here to this specific moment in time.
This is Jenna Ellis in the morning.
Good morning. It is Wednesday, August 26th, and as a lot of people are commenting on social media, the last probably universally loved person passed away yesterday, Dolly Parton, and we extend sincere condolences to her family. And she really was, as a country music and just overall icon and legend, somehow managed to stay universally loved on all sides throughout her career and her philanthropic mission. And so that was a huge loss that came really unexpected yesterday. So the other unexpected news yesterday was that Darlene Graham won the South Carolina GOP primary runoff election for her brother's seat. So this was very, very close, 52 to 48% in the primary runoff over Ralph Norman Tuesday in South Carolina. And she said in her victory speech, these past few weeks have been an unbelievably challenging time for our family, but you know what? We did it. And so Ralph Norman used his concession speech to say he was sad for the state and he didn't get why Trump intervened for Graham. And this is actually the thrust of what I want to talk about, because if Ralph Norman, who is part of the Freedom Caucus in Congress and has been in politics several decades, doesn't understand why Trump would do this, then he just really doesn't get politics. And Darlene Graham, in my opinion, of course, is not at all competent for this seat. I think this was a big mistake for the people of South Carolina to elect her basically just in her brother's memory and because of the Trump endorsement. But this goes to show how the establishment, the new MAGA establishment perhaps, is still alive and well, because Ralph Norman, of course, endorsed Nikki Haley in the 2024 primary. He has been at odds with Trump on a few things. He's been overall a really great conservative, obviously part of the Freedom Caucus. But that's been Trump's MO, beyond the fact that Graham, of course, is carrying on her brother's legacy, and Trump not only appointed her to that seat because of her brother's very untimely passing, but then also endorsed her, I think, over Ralph Norman, literally for the exact same reasons that he really went hard in the primaries against former Congressman Bob Good, Chip Roy, Thomas Massie, and others, because Trump carries grudges in politics often, and for those who he perceives as not being a team player, doing his will and bidding, then they're off the team. So does the Freedom Caucus really understand the political landscape moving forward? That's the question that I want to ask our good friend Steve Deace, who, of course, is the host of the Steve Deace Show over at The Blaze. And Steve, I understand that Ralph Norman, obviously is disappointed, all of those things, but to say he really doesn't understand why Trump intervened for Graham, I think is really evidencing that he doesn't understand Trump at all.
Or it could be that he really understands Trump's base. There is no market for criticism of Trump. There's no market for it. Our voters don't want to hear it. They don't respond to it. And so, it's just the reality. So you almost have to, every time you want to be critical of something, you have to do it indirectly. You have to frame it with an assumption that Trump's been misinformed or misled. Any frontal, I've just learned this over a decade, any frontal criticism of Trump, on really no matter what it is, from the right, will just shut everybody down. And a lot of this is the conditioning of most of the criticisms, the vast majority of it, like 95% of it from the left, is so over the top, so ridiculous, so inflamed, and or false, but I repeat myself, that at this point, just everybody's default mechanism is, I just tune it out. So it could be very well be this was a passive-aggressive way of bringing up a point without criticizing the king, because he is king of the GOP. It's the king the people elected they want. And so, that's just the reality of the world we're in. And criticizing him directly just gets you nowhere. It won't move anything, doesn't move him, doesn't move his base. Everybody will get very defensive and territorial right away. And so you almost always have to frame it. If you want to have any movement at all, anyway, you almost have to frame it passive aggressively, or as if Trump just got bad advice. There's almost a papal infallibility bestowed upon him from our base. And so, people in you and I's positions have a decision to make where that's concerned. And some of us, some of my friends, for example, can't handle that. And so just want to reflexively rail against it all the more just out of spite, which is great. There's a part of that I adore, but understand that it'll just render you less and less effective. That's the cost and trade-off. Others of us, and I put myself in this camp, have just accepted that that's the ecosystem in which we operate. And so if you want to advance ideas, you live in Florida now. You know, you guys have 3,000% humidity. It's the month of August. You know, you
It's
can
175
decide,
degrees out right now. Yeah.
Well, but most of the time there's 3,000% humidity, and so you can decide, hey, it's winter, and I don't care. I don't care what the humidity factor is. I don't care what the climate is. I'm layering it up. Well, you're going to pay the penalty for that, and that's the environment in which we live. I'm just honest about it.
Mm-hmm. And I agree with you that there is this kind of reflexive positioning among the base that Trump can do no wrong. And a lot of that is because of how over the top the criticism of Trump initially was in the beginning. It was just so ridiculous. I mean, calling him a racist, saying that, he didn't know what he was doing. He's, borderline dementia, I mean, all of these things that were just completely fabricated over the top nonsense. And then coupling that with in 2024, Trump demanded absolute loyalty. I mean, it wasn't even just a reflex from the base. It was an actual demand from him. And that kind of culture in politics becomes really dangerous when you look at the endorsements and the record of the endorsements and say, okay, well, since Trump endorsed, then I can't even question that. We should always be able to question our politicians. And so you and I do fall into that category where we are willing to point out things. Obviously, you and I want him to succeed. We voted for him. We didn't support him in the primary, but we'll do that as conservatives. But we overall want him to succeed. And so we'll point out areas of growth and then also things that he's done well. But overall, I think that the Freedom Caucus may be doing this in a way that isn't actually helpful for their position. Because obviously you and I are in a different position as commentators, as outsiders. I mean, I was in a different position when I literally worked for him, obviously. There were things I disagreed with, but that was private. I never said any of that publicly because I literally spoke for him, and that's the job. But when you're in Congress and when you're actually part of the GOP in elected office, it seems to me that there has to be a better strategy than what a lot of these people like Ralph Norman are doing to not really help advance anything in the GOP. And then it just basically devolves into this loyalty contest that they're not going to win.
Great analysis. I mean, listen, there's no heroes here. This state is wrecked. I mean, the Palmetto State has been pathetic and pitiful our entire lives. I mean, to have Tim Scott and Lindsey Graham be the senators of that state for as long as they were is ridiculous. We had Trey Gowdy is the definition of all hat, no cattle. Guy made an entire career out of one House testimony question, getting Hillary to say, what difference does it make? But, I mean, from a politician standpoint, and as a member of Congress, he looked like Tarzan and played like Jane, okay? I mean, he was a total rhino in Congress. You had Mark Sanford, remember him? Chased his side piece girlfriend to Argentina. Jeff Duncan was like, well, that's the one conservative in South Carolina we can rely on. Turns out he was living a double life for years. That entire state's political ecosystem. So I think we have to analyze, how do you get to a place where a total moron gets one of only 100 U.S. Senate seats, an admitted moron who literally told you, I don't know anything. She's going to vote on treaties and doesn't know anything about China and its place, in the foreign global geopolitical scene. By her own admission, she didn't hide any of this. She literally told you out loud, my only qualifications, I'm DNA adjacent and share a last name. This whole campaign is there's a movie many years ago called The Distinguished Gentleman with Eddie Murphy, where he runs for House. He's black. James Garner was the white congressman. He dies in office, and he runs for his seat because he's got the same name. It's like Carl Jackson or something. I don't remember what it was, but he has the same name. People don't know the guy died. They're so uninformed. They're so tapped out. They just vote this guy into office because they think they've been voting for the same guy that's the guy they've been voting for all this time. This is what this is. All right? This is supposed to be one of the reddest states in the union. Its entire delegation for decades has been a collective failure. And so this woman just openly said, I am not qualified for this job, right? And her family cynically one of the most brazenly cynical things I've seen in my time in politics, capitalized on largely fake and astroturfed mourning for her rhino brother to get a Senate seat. So this is the ecosystem this is all spawned on. Ralph Northam is a great congressman. Who in the world told that guy, you know what I think you ought to do? As a member of the Freedom Caucus, nothing says Freedom Caucus quite like endorsing Nikki Haley. Well, Steve, it's his home state's governor. So by the time we got to the South Carolina primary, it was clear she was toast. It was clear after Iowa, Trump was going to be the nominee. Just switch your endorsement, right? Realize, hey, King is coming. Better get on the right side of the track. And he's probably a member of the U.S. Senate, and America is better off now. There are no heroes here. Trump's endorsement record, overall wins and losses, is great, but he's endorsed so many rhinos that are now knifing him and us. On the other hand, though, a lot of the people that get inspired to run that are native to him, for every Ron DeSantis that comes out of his ecosystem, there's been 20 Marjorie Taylor Greens who either couldn't get elected or because they were total clowns, or once they got elected, figured out, pretty much showed us they're total clowns. So this is a putrid ecosystem on our side. It has been for decades. And this is a generational failure. It's going to take a long time that hopefully we have, I'm not sure we do, to dig out from this. And, one place where I think your whole audience ought to have some hope is in the gubernatorial race in my home state of Iowa with Zach Lane. And he beat a Trump endorsement. I helped him do it. That's rare. He won by 1,700 votes statewide to be the gubernatorial nominee. And so if he could win this fall, he's now suddenly the governor of the first of the nation caucus state. And that's going to, and he represents the kind of paradigm shift that people are looking for. He represents what I think is going to be the coalition of the future on the right, which is Maha with Christian conservatism. That's essentially who Zach is. And so this is kind of the last gasp of what has been a generational failure on the right. And this is the yakety sax music. The climactic number here is the election of just an absolute uninformed moron as a U.S. senator by your own admission and demonstration.
Yeah, and a couple of observations about this ecosystem is that first, way back when, if we all remember 10 years ago when Trump got into politics, one of the biggest things that he ran on besides, build the wall, let's make America great again, obviously those things, was drain the swamp. The swamp has only gotten deeper and more murky since Trump came along because he basically enabled it, and he's empowered this very same people that he professed to be going against once he was entrenched in D.C. and within the establishment. The GOP has not actually gotten better. I mean, this was what the Freedom Caucus wanted to do, was to say, let's get back ultimately to conservatism. And a lot of these movements that are trying to go against the establishment, I mean, the Tea Party back in the day, have ultimately failed because they've never had a champion who's actually been the president and then has gone against that entrenched system. It's almost like it's so overpowering that you say you run as an outsider, but once you get in and you get all the accolades and you get everything, then you just become part of the swamp and it just overtakes you. And if somebody like Donald Trump, who had all of the money and the status and the name ID and everything else, if he couldn't do it, then that says just how deep and dark and frankly malevolent all of this is. And second,
I don't disagree. What I would say is, and I think in his first term, he truly thought he was going to do that.
I do too.
And I truly do. And but that's how you got Scaramucci's, Omarosas, trying to hire people within his personal ecosystem, and they weren't up for the task. And I think he was determined, you know what, when I get elected again, I'm just going to have to actually have my own swamp to get anything done. And I think that's and I don't think his analysis there, by the way, is incorrect by and large. Because that is the reality of this is all the cost of taking a generation off from taking your citizenship seriously. And that's what much of America has done.
And he also had Reince Priebus as his first chief of staff, who literally was establishment GOP swamp. And so there was a mixture there. And the understanding of the way that Washington worked was too overpowering for people like who frankly weren't competent at the jobs, like the Scaramucci's and the Omarosas. And even speaking, for myself going into all of that, I mean, there was so much I didn't know that it takes a while to get acclimated. And so he didn't have anybody who actually understood the game, who was willing to then help him go against the game. And I think that if he had had some of those key players, it might have actually been different. And I wish that it had been different. He hadn't hired, some of the incompetent people along with the establishment people that just told him. I mean, his own White House counsel was telling him for his entire first term, you can't do that, and stopping him basically at every turn. So there were a lot of things in the first administration, but he could have come back in the second administration stronger and wiser and focused more on actually draining the swamp and getting rid of the establishment instead of pursuing basically a personal vendetta out of this kind of wrong-headed view of, well, you just have to have loyalty, and now focusing on foreign policy, which is a whole other conversation and show. But I want to get to the second point real quick so that you can react as well, is that when you mention that Ralph Northam should have simply said, okay, he's going to be the nominee, let me get on board. That was what Ron DeSantis did right, because even though he ran against him, everything else, as soon as Trump was the nominee, I mean, even before he was the nominee, as soon as DeSantis understood he's going to win this thing, he immediately conceded and he full-throated endorsed. And that's the problem as well with these people who want to be world changers and all that, even in my home state of Florida. Listen, Byron Donalds was not my first choice, but is he better than the Democrat who is for, transing children, DEI, all kind of left-wing lunatic politics? Absolutely. So am I going to end up supporting Byron Donalds? Absolutely, because that's what we need to do in these circumstances. And I think that there is still this segment of the Freedom Caucus kind of esque mindset that we have to go against the grain at every turn, and they see compromise as a weakness when at times it's actually more strategic.
Well, I'm glad you thought that was a good move for DeSantis, because some of us had a very private and blunt conversation in the hours after the Iowa caucuses that, let's just say that led to that decision, okay? Because I'm not really much for compromise, but I'm a big fan of wisdom.
Yes.
So maybe we should actually bill it as that, is some wisdom. And hey, he's king. So he gets to do what he wants. He's the king that people want. So it's not fair, but it is what it is. And so if you want to operate within his kingdom, you've got to be a lot more astute than, let me endorse Nikki Haley. First of all, even if Trump had not run, Nikki Haley was never going to be the nominee of this party in a million years. That was never happening, okay? 100%. That's a campaign from 2004. So it's not fair to Ralph that one endorsement overwhelms an overall, pretty high-end congressional career. But, this is the game we're in. And you just have to make more astute political observations than that. You just have to have more wisdom than that. That's just the sad reality of the world we live in today.
Absolutely. And we've got to take a break here. Unfortunately, Steve Deace, these are always the conversations that could go, 3 hours or even longer. And I know that you're going to continue to talk about these things on your show as well. And it's important overall, not just to, point out the incompetency of Darlene Graham or the missteps of Ralph Norman or, any of these things, but because of the broader picture of where exactly is the conservative movement heading. And that's the bigger question that we are going to have to seriously ask and very seriously answer as a coalition and as a movement. Moving forward, especially when after 2028, Trump's name is not going to be on the ballot. And as much as he may endorse, there is going to be another champion that has to rise up for the conservative movement and hopefully assume the office of the presidency. And if we don't get behind all of that together, it's not going to bode well. We'll be right back. Hi, I'm Jenna Ellis. One of the things I appreciate most about this program is that it's listener funded. That means we don't rely on commercial advertisers or outside interests. Your monthly gift of any amount helps keep American Family Radio and this program on the air, reaching thousands of people each week with a biblical worldview. To become a monthly financial partner, visit afr.net/give. That's afr.net/give. Thank you so much for standing with us.
Dr. Jessica Peck talked about reimagining the church with Dr. Rich Griffith.
But what if we became the church that realized, hey, we need to be family to each other? Young people have left the church because they had no ownership, very little accountability. It was like we were going to wait till young people became adults and then they became a leader, but we never did anything to prepare them to be a leader in advance.
Find this interview and other episodes of Dr. Nurse Mama on the podcast page at afr.net.
Hi, I'm Jan Harper. If you're a pastor's wife, you know both the blessings and the unique challenges that come with the life you and your husband live daily. We call it living in the fishbowl.
Details have been announced for the 2026 Pastors and Wives Fishbowl Retreat. Once again, this year's retreat will be at Pickwick Landing State Park in Counce, Tennessee. From October 20th through the 22nd, pastors and their wives will enjoy rest, renewal, and fellowship hosted by Pastor Bert Harper, Director of Marriage, Family, and Pastoral Ministries at AFA and co-host of Exploring the Word on AFR, and his wife, Jan. Our special speaker will be J.J. Jasper of AFR. Your registration fee covers lodging, meals, and materials. All you need to do is get there. The annual AFA Pastors and Wives Fishbowl Retreat, October 20th through 22nd. Learn more and register at repairingthefoundations.net.
We'd love to see you there.
Hello, Americans. I'm Todd Stern. Stand by for news and commentary next. Parents in Palo Alto, California are suing the school district after their kids were taken on a field trip to a local mosque. The students encouraged to wear Islamic religious attire, and they were exposed to a message that portrayed Islam as a social justice religion. Well, it turns out Palo Alto High School's been dispatching kids to mosques for years, thanks to a partnership with the Muslim Community Association. What's interesting is that no Christians are a part of the lawsuit. The plaintiffs, Jewish and Hindu. They allege students were exposed to the San Francisco chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations. Last year, Florida Congressman Randy Fine introduced legislation that designated CARE as a terrorist organization. Could you imagine the uproar if the Muslim kids had been forced to go to the First Baptist Church for a baptism service? By the way, be sure to read my new book, The Golden Age, available at your favorite bookstore. Good day.
Welcome back to Jenna Ellis in the Morning on American Family Radio.
Welcome back. And so we talked a little bit yesterday about the Supreme Court's decision for the Trump administration on this important procedural victory on the mail-in ballot restrictions. But the Supreme Court did not finally determine that the executive order's mail-in ballot restrictions are lawful. And so I wanted to do a little bit deeper dive into this with Hans von Sparovsky, who is a senior legal fellow at Advancing American Freedom and has been doing election integrity for decades and, really can get into some of the fine print on this. So Hans, good morning. And where do we stand on not only this issue, but then, election integrity in general?
Well, I'd have to say, one of the biggest things that's annoyed me since the Supreme Court decision has come out is that all these media sources keep talking about the president's restrictive rules on absentee ballots. That is just totally wrong. What he did was try to increase the security and integrity of absentee ballots. And what the Supreme Court said was that the injunction that had been issued by a Obama judge in Massachusetts, nationwide injunction, they threw it out because they said the states that brought the lawsuit couldn't show any damages. So here's what this is all about. There were three main issues before the court. The first was the president's executive order told the Department of Homeland Security to create and send to states a citizenship list for each state. The list would be every resident of the state over the age of 18, and therefore eligible to vote, who was a U.S. citizen. Now, the states weren't required to use the list. The executive order didn't say that. It just said, DHS, send this to states so they, if they want to, can use it to check their voter registration lists to make sure that everyone who's voting is actually a citizen. Can you believe it? The 23 states that sued, all blue states, said it was a violation of the Constitution for DHS to produce a list like that and send it to him. Just totally ridiculous. And yet this Obama judge issued an injunction against it. Supreme Court threw that out. The second issue was that the president told the Department of Justice, I want you to prioritize the investigation and, as appropriate, the prosecution of state and local officials or anybody else who gives a ballot to an ineligible voter. The judge also enjoined that. In other words, the judge was telling the Justice Department, you are not allowed to enforce the law if you find that someone has violated a federal criminal statute. Supreme Court tossed that out. The third issue, and this was probably the one that's drawn the most attention, is the president directed the Postal Service to initiate a rulemaking that would do several things. First of all, it would set up a tracking system for mail-in ballots that would put a barcode on the outside of ballots of envelopes that contain mail-in ballots. Look, Jenna, that's a smart thing to do. That's what Federal Express, that's what UPS all do. When we order stuff from Amazon, we can track that package. Why would you not want to do that with absentee ballots, which contain someone's vote? And yet the states didn't want that either, and the judge enjoined it. Now, the rules also were supposed to create a situation where states that were going to use mail-in ballots are supposed to notify the Postal Service by giving them the names of everyone who was going to receive a mail-in ballot so that the Postal Service could make sure when they get an envelope that it's one of the authorized people from the states. Again, the judge enjoined that. The Supreme Court threw all of that out because they said none of the states had showed that they were somehow going to be damaged by this. So that's the situation. Unfortunately, this same judge in Massachusetts issued a second injunction, and this was not the one that was before the court, once again telling the Postal Service it can't put any rules that it comes up with into force. And so far, despite what the Supreme Court said, she hasn't lifted that injunction.
Wow. And, a lot of this just goes back to the problem that the left just doesn't want election integrity, period. And so they're going to manufacture all of these legal pretexts for, reasons like this is an infringement of the time, place, and manner restriction and the Constitution. And, and some of those may be ultimately meritorious, unfortunately. But it seems to me that the job of the U.S. Postal Service is to deliver mail to the appropriate person and to ensure that it's not misdelivered. There can be protections and rules and regulations in place. I mean, this is what the Postmaster General is supposed to be doing. And so for the federal government to simply ensure that the mail is authentic and that it goes to the actually right person, I mean, this isn't disenfranchisement of voters, because if it's misdelivered or given to somebody who's not eligible anyway, you're not disenfranchising someone who doesn't have the right to access the franchise to begin with.
Oh, no, you are absolutely right. But look, you and I both know the reason these blue states, particularly the states that are now doing all-mail elections, Washington, Oregon, California, the reason they sued over this, and the reason they don't want the kind of tracking system that everybody else uses for all the stuff, like I said, the products we order from places like Amazon, the reason they don't want it is because for years they have been telling everyone, the mail-in balloting system is perfectly safe. There's not ever any problems with it. And if we actually had a tracking system, well, then we would start getting all kinds of data on Well, how often are mail-in ballots misdelivered? How often are they not delivered on time? Because, for example, they're sitting in a U.S. Postal Service distribution center somewhere. How often are these mail-in ballots going astray and not ending up where they should? That kind of data, and I think there would be a lot of it, would hurt that mythical image that these states have built up about how safe absentee or mail-in balloting is, and they don't want that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just the bottom line is they don't want to treat ballots as a thing of value like every other mail transaction, electronic transaction, or anything else that is safe and secure in the United States. Somehow the voting process to them has to be treated completely differently to somehow actually ensure more safety? No. Have they shown that people are actually disenfranchised by simple things like voter ID, like ensuring that mail is properly delivered? No. So, I mean, it's just obvious what their enterprise is and what they're trying to accomplish. And it's frustrating that it seems like often the courts are not seeing through this, or at least acknowledging and just saying, no, this is, this is ridiculous. And we're not going to allow this pretext to override the common sense rationale here. And that's what I'm the most frustrated in, because we know that the Democrats are going to try, and the left and all that, they're going to try to do their thing and to rig the game. But for the judiciary, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever that especially the Supreme Court and even some of these other federal judges wouldn't see through these arguments.
Well, that's true, but I have to tell you, the judge in this particular case, the Massachusetts judge, Judge Talawani, look, the Supreme Court's opinion really, while it doesn't, criticize her by name, it points out just how irrational her injunction is. I mean, the biggest irrationality of it is that the Supreme Court points out is that the executive order is all directives to people within the executive branch. There's not a single order in there to the states. There's nothing telling the states they have to do this or have to do that. It's all directed to the Postal Service, the Department of Homeland Security, et cetera. So, how are these states claiming somehow that they're damaged by it? In fact, the court points out that in order to be able to say that the states were somehow damaged, the judge had to pile one speculation on top of another speculation, on top of another speculation, and that is not the way the federal court system, as you well know, works.
Yeah. And this is where if we actually had accountability and we had kind of this layering of, okay, the left is trying to promulgate these ridiculous arguments, then this judge is not acting with rationality, or is maybe one of these judges that is exceeding their authority and so forth, then the next step, of course, is to try to impeach some of these judges who are clearly going rogue. But the GOP, at least in the Congress so far, even with a majority that could at least haul these guys in and make them, even if they're not successful in actually removing them, conviction in the Senate and so forth, they could at least require them to answer before the Senate. But they don't seem to have any interest in doing that or actual accountability. I mean, all we get generally are, some of these hearings that maybe have some clips and, bombastic, Twitter comments and a strongly worded letter, but nothing that actually amounts to accountability. So where is the GOP on this? Because last I checked, election integrity has been a very important issue for a really long time, but especially to President Trump in particular since the last election.
Well, look, I agree with you. I think that's exactly what needs to be done, and so far that hasn't really happened except in very rare circumstances. And as you know, I mean, related to that is the fact that the SAVE Act which would help prevent aliens from illegally registering and voting. While it passed the House, it's been stuck in the Senate because of a small handful of Republicans who are opposed to it, like Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Tom Tillis of North Carolina, who fortunately is leaving the Senate. But no, it's a real problem, particularly because you have all these rogue judges like Talwani who are repeatedly defying the Supreme Court. I mean, look, those Postal Service rules are not going to go into effect because what was up before the Supreme Court was the first injunction that she issued. She issued a second injunction on August 11th, and so far, despite the Supreme Court's ruling, she has refused to lift that injunction. So once again, the Justice Department is going to have to fight over that and probably once again have to file an emergency appeal with the Supreme Court. That, to me, is outright defiance by a federal judge.
Yeah, I agree. And we've got to take a break here, Hans von Sparovsky, but I so appreciate your analysis and passion for this issue as well, because I think a lot of listeners and, so much, obviously, of the conservative base is very frustrated that, it's been 6 years and we don't actually have a lot of movement on election integrity. And it seems like this has kind of fallen by the wayside in some ways. I mean, it's good to see that the Trump administration is issuing some of these executive orders and doing what they can. But when the legislative and the judicial branches won't also view election integrity as a nonpartisan critical issue to the security of our elections, then this is all he can do. So we'll continue to follow this, and always appreciate your analysis. You can follow him and also Advancing American Freedom on X. We'll be right back.
The Awakening with Bishop E.W. Jackson.
We have not been made the greatest nation in the history of mankind by denigrating God. We have become the greatest nation on earth because we are a nation that acknowledged Almighty God to be the source of our values, our rights, our liberties, and that therefore we are accountable to Him.
The Awakening on the podcast page at afr.net.
Have you ever felt like there's a depth to Scripture that you haven't been able to reach yet? Well, Rabbi Schneider, he takes you there. Every weekday, he dives into the Jewish roots of the Christian faith, and trust me, it will change the way that you read your Bible. I'm Dustin Roberts, the host of Discovering the Jewish Jesus, and you can hear Rabbi on Sundays at 8 a.m. Central Time right here on American Family Radio.
Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Romans 12:2. My name is Abraham Hamilton III, and this is the Hamilton Minute. Paul's epistle to the Romans was written to believers. This verse highlights the fact that it's possible for Christians to be conformed to the world's ways. The word conform there means to be squeezed into the mold of another. Rather than being squeezed into the world's mold, the Lord requires us to be transformed by having our minds renewed by God's word. Everything about us must be held up to the light of Scripture, and wherever there's any discrepancy, we must be transformed.
Listen each weekday from 5 to 6 p.m. Central for the Hamilton Corner with Abraham Hamilton III, Public Policy Analyst for the American Family Association.
Hello, this is Walker Wildman. Midterm elections are less than 90 days away. America will soon choose between continuing to return government to biblical values or turning away from these values. We could even lose the U.S. Supreme Court. We could see Trump administration officials impeached by a left-wing Congress. We could also see doors for righteous government continue to swing open, or they could quickly close. You can play an important role in the upcoming election. Your generous gift will help AFA Action and our voter education arm, iVoter Guide, inform and mobilize many more biblical voters to make an impact for Christ in the upcoming elections. Every dollar you give has 6 times the impact due to our over 60 partner organizations spreading the word about iVoterGuide. And we have an extensively trained volunteer outreach program. To give, go to afaaction.net. That's afaaction.net, afaaction.net.
Welcome back to Jenna Ellis in the Morning on American Family Radio.
Welcome back. Well, former NBA players Inez Kanter-Freedom and Royce White will not be eligible to play in the WNBA after both declared themselves women and eligible for the draft. League sources told Front Office Sports, and so the recent declarations of Freedom and White are quote-unquote simply publicity stunts, and the league is, quote, not going to give oxygen to efforts designed to mock the league or use this topic to demean and marginalize others, one league source said. The WNBA will not allow outside pressure or manufactured controversy to dictate league processes. So my question for the WNBA is, first of all, nobody else has ever done a publicity stunt. I mean, I wasn't aware that that was against the rules, but also how dare you inquire into the adequacy of what is a woman when heretofore you have never decided that you wanted to actually set a rule on what constitutes a woman being eligible to play for the WNBA. And so to simply declare that somehow in your estimation, which is very arbitrary because there is no standard, that somehow Freedom and White are doing this to manufacture controversy when other men who decide that they want to become women and play in women's sports aren't doing it for the same reasons is utterly hypocritical. And it also goes to show how the left only prefers their own and their own political bias instead of actually wanting to pursue a standard. This isn't about ensuring fairness or equality or women actually in sports. This is about selecting and preferring arbitrarily the people and the political bias that they prefer and the speech and conduct ultimately that they prefer while excluding others. So I hope that this actually gives rise to more legal suits and we can get kind of to the bottom of this and sort of force a resolution that is actually fair and has a standard. And so let's welcome in Congressman Marlin Stutzman from the great state of Indiana. And this whole thing just proves the point that the left is not actually interested in fairness. They're not interested in reality. They're not interested in standards. They're just interested in tailoring the rules, changing the rules whenever it suits their ultimate purpose.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jenna. Great to be with you this morning. This has become a real sideshow. Unfortunately, the WNBA is off to a really great season, and the attention that the WNBA has received over the past couple of seasons is really phenomenal because they've got some really good basketball and they've got some great basketball players that people want to watch. I mean, Caitlin Clark is right here in Indiana, and the Fever are a team that the Hoosiers and people are, young girls around the country are flocking to see wherever they travel or whether they're here in Indianapolis. Sophie Cunningham. She's another just a great basketball player, but, a lot of the attention that's been given to her is because she's just simply using common sense and using, when asked, is sharing her beliefs. And then, of course, the left attacks her and the liberal woke are going after her at basketball arenas around the country. But, one of the things that I found really interesting, Jenna, is that, I was watching Jason Whitlock. He's a former NBA basketball player and a really, great Christian guy who's got a podcast. But, one of his comments was that his take is that the WNBA is not pro-transgender men playing in their league. They are pro-women living a male lifestyle. And he goes on to show, like Brittany Griner in an interview was asked by in the interview about being a grandparent. And mentioned that, she wants to be called Pops. She, of course, is a lesbian. And, there's quite a few lesbians in the WNBA. And if you watch some of them, it's like these women would rather play the role of men. And I think that's the conflict that's really going on inside the WNBA that Jason Whitlock points out, that they don't want Ennis Freedom to come in and play basketball with them. They don't want Bryce White to come in and play basketball with them. They want to protect the lesbian structure that's inside the WNBA with a male, quote unquote, female relationship that are two women. And after he mentioned that, I think that's really insightful because this has gone on way too far. The WNBA, like Charles Barkley said yesterday, former WNBA Hall of Famer, said that the WNBA should nip this in the bud and put this to rest, that this is an easy, simple decision to make, but yet they drag it out because they're trying not to offend, I believe, some of their players who we all know are women, but trying to live a male lifestyle, apparently.
And yeah, that's a really fascinating observation that I hadn't considered, that, this isn't just about excluding biological men on the basis of the fact that they're not women, which if that's what they were doing and they actually had a uniform standard for that, that's really the thrust of where everyone's going with this. But you're absolutely right that in the context of this whole, trans nonsense conversation and the LGBTQ mafia and all of that, the goal in part of all of this is to blur the lines not only of physical biological gender, but also the spiritual heritage of the roles and responsibilities of the difference between masculinity and femininity. And this isn't just, traditional gender roles that are oppressive or in this kind of Marxist framework that the left suggests. This is actually part of our Imago Dei and how the Lord created us as male and female. And there are traits that necessarily go along with that a lot of women unfortunately don't want. They don't want to be feminine, and a lot of men anymore do not want to be masculine. And so you get this weird queer crossover because people are refusing to abide by the laws of nature and of nature's God, and it's playing out in a lot of different ways. And so where do you think ultimately that we go from here as a culture, and for the conservative movement to speak clearly on this issue? Because it's not just about some of this that is drawing attention to the issue. It ultimately needs to be about a solution.
Yeah, well, I think they have a losing argument ultimately, but thank goodness that Ennis Freedom and Royce White are willing to step up and call out the hypocrisy and say, you know what, according to the rules of the WNBA, the Women's National Basketball Association, they said, well, we apparently are eligible to play in the WNBA if we identify as women. And so they're calling out the hypocrisy, and I think they're doing the right thing by taking this even to court if they have to, because the WNBA, and they're making such a mess out of all of this. Some people say, well, any media is good media. I don't think in this case, because what's happened, what we're seeing on the court, the attacks on Caitlin Clark, the punch to the neck, the hard fouling against Sophie Cunningham, you have to start worrying about workplace environment and the safety for the players, and not just Sophie and Caitlin, but for every player, because as soon as a player attacks, let's say a Sophie Cunningham, and then there's a response from Sophie's fans, and then there become death threats and things like that, which are all wrong. It puts both players in danger, and I think it's important for the WNBA to say we're not going to allow any of this to happen, because we don't want people to take things to an extreme and having death threats against either side. And that's why they need to, as you said, stop blurring the lines, because when you have blurred lines, people don't know what the rules are and where it's going. And so I think, with a lawsuit, and it appears that even Matt Gaetz, former congressman, is willing to help as their legal counsel, take this to court, challenge it. And, if they can't make a decision, let's make a decision, let the legal, courts make that decision for them. I would think that would be possible. I'm not a lawyer myself, but I would think that would be some sort of guidance, because they've got a good thing going for them. But, of course, the WNBA, and you look at the ownership, to the management, to the coaches, and to the players, There's, it's full of lesbians from, a lot of lesbians in that whole league. And I think that's what they're fighting against internally is a woke ideology. And they have to remember how many women fought for years and years for these rights and the notoriety and the opportunity to play basketball in a league like this at this elite level. They're ruining something that so many women fought for. And a lot of it is coming from the leftist women that are going after the definitions that should define all of this and make it very simple.
Yeah, and I hope that as this plays out in the courts, that we'll actually get judges who are willing to recognize a lot of these issues that you and I have been talking about, and hold in a manner that actually creates a rule that makes sense. But what about the legislative angle? We only have a couple more minutes, but it seems to me that that states and also even at the federal level need to start clarifying for civil society, some of these parameters and drafting legislation accordingly.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. And, my wife, Christy, served in the Indiana legislature and filed some of the first legislation in Indiana to keep our boys from playing in women's sports, which, is, again, it's an 80-20 issue when it even comes to polling, but it's also the right thing to do. And, we have the NCAA headquartered in Indiana, and I'll tell you, I've never seen anybody so weak in making a decision, and because it's like they don't want to offend anybody. And, what's offensive is that when you do actually have a transgender male, a male, on a swimming podium that just, beat Riley Gaines, and we all see it. I mean, everybody knows it's an unfair competition because of the male anatomy versus the female anatomy. And that's where I believe at some point states are, passing legislation that's saying boys can't play in girls' sports. President Trump has even, signed an executive order to do the same, and we're pushing legislation. So I think legislation does have to be implemented because these governing bodies simply aren't doing what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, well said. And I hope that the GOP somehow after the midterms can take this seriously and we get to a resolution. I mean, this is just so literally insane that society has reached this point. But Rep. Marlon Stutzman, appreciate it. You can reach me and my team, Jenna at afr.net.
The views and opinions expressed in this broadcast may not necessarily reflect those of the American Family Association or American Family